Well, I think we'll get started here, and we may have other folks joining us as we go along, but I sure am pleased to see so many of you here. This little tour has been an idea of mine for a long, long time, but we just didn't have the right occasion to pull it off, so today's the day, and we're lucky to have such a nice day. So I guess I'd also say it's appropriate that we meet at the flagpole. For one thing, it's an easy place to find, so we can gather, but also it's adjacent to our Veterans Memorial. And in a recent survey by the congregation, the Veterans Memorial and activities like that was rated as a real high priority for the mission of Vermont Church, and has a long history of noting and remembering veterans. And this is a project that started probably around, I'm going to guess, 2004, and we just recently added another marker at the far end that included the Gulf War and beyond, which is it's almost 50 years. And I find it interesting that that marker only has 11 names in those 50 years, but if you look at Vietnam or World War II or even World War I or Korea, there were many, many more. So, wars are fought differently now, so thankfully it requires fewer soldiers. But anyway, on this little tour, I've got about 25 or 26 stops to make, and we will be talking about some experiences of some veterans as well. And we do think that's important. So for those of you who don't know, my name is John Ernest, and I'm the Secretary-Treasurer of the Vermont Cemetery Association. And the others on the Cemetery Association, and some of these are people you may know, would be Jim Hurling and Greg Hurling and Dave Haugen and Karsten Haugen and Gary Olson. And we are a cemetery association, but we're also part of the church, as opposed to, for example, maybe a municipal cemetery or a private cemetery. We act like an association, but we actually are part of the church, meaning that we appoint our own members and have our own budget, that type of thing. So with that, I just want to move that direction a little bit, just behind the golf carts, and talk a little bit about our map and directory. So this is a project we started, I'm going to say started about in 2009, and it took it seems ridiculous, but about 3 years to finally get it to fruition. And prior to that, I had 3 maps that depicted the burials in the cemetery, but they were pencil written, hard to see, and so I ciphered out those 3, and what we wanted to do, obviously, is put it into a spreadsheet form, or so that we could transfer that into map format. And so it was pretty much a clipboard and a pencil and paper out on the cemetery. And then Gary Olson, another member of our Cemetery Association, he went around and kind of proofed some of the things that I had done, and then I'd go back and proof some of the things he had done. And then Terry DeWitt, who is a member here at Vermont, he's pretty handy with signage, and so he put together the very first map and directory. So we have the directory in alphabetical order, so if you know somebody looking for somebody in the cemetery, you can find them alphabetically, and that will refer to a grid on our map. So and we're trying to keep that up to date as we can. Last update was April of 24, and then probably sometime this winter we'll update the directory again so that we keep it as close to update as possible. So we're going to also talk about our QR project and the results of that here shortly. Some of you may have heard about it. Does anybody know what QR stands for? I talk about it forever, but what does QR stand for? Well, I had to look it up myself. Quick response. So in other words, instead of having to do a search on the internet or whatever, we have these codes. They're not like barcodes, because barcodes were only good for 20 characters, but a QR code is maybe in an infinite number, almost an infinite number of characters. And so you see them at restaurants. Sometimes you don't even get handed a menu. You get handed, well, you use your smartphone. So we'll talk about that a little bit. It's not really a training session for that, believe me, but it's you'll get to see some of the features of it. And what I have found, and I think others have found too, it's not so much well, it is the information that you see on the QR code or on the link, but it's the discovery of things maybe you didn't know about, and that happens to me all the time. In fact, this morning I came up to just to polish my story here a little bit, and I discovered something entirely new. But anyway, so we'll go out in the cemetery. We're going to take a loop around, and don't be afraid to ask questions as we go. We'll move just a short distance over here into the cemetery. And in our first stop, and it's just this little lonely marker of two young boys, Albert and Carl Vestrom, which isn't even a familiar name to Vermont any longer, so the family must have moved away. But Albert, born in 1876 and died in 1878, and Carl, born in 1878 and died in 1878. So it's incredible when we did this mapping and started recording data how many children are buried out here. It's from early on, and this was one of the earliest markers here on the cemetery too. There was a previous cemetery, and I'll tell you about that a little bit as we move along here, but healthcare obviously wasn't anything too great at that time, and there are dozens of children, just 4 or 5 years old or less, out here on the cemetery. Some of them identified and some not, but I'll go over some of that too. You'll notice that this is a brand new marker. Well, this particular one, when the gathering place was built, was actually damaged by machinery or whatever, and there's a guy that used to call me up, and he's not even a member of the church, but he called and said, couldn't we do something about some of these markers, especially these children? And he said, I don't want anybody to know who I am, but I'll be glad to fund this. So we ordered some markers. There's 3 or 4 around, and as we progress, maybe there'll be more. But he funded it. Dave Haugen and I put them in place, and the guy, he wanted to be anonymous, but he's passed recently, and his name was Tom Handel. Tom lived just out of Black Earth on Highway 78, and I just loved it when he'd call me because I knew something good was going to happen. And again, he's very modest about what he did, and but I think it's certainly worth noting. And you'll see, like I say, 3 or 4 of these new monuments, and that's as a result of Tom's funding. So now we'll move over closer to the swing set, and I have another marker that I'd like to talk about. Well, this is the marker of John, Ann, and Tora Dybdahl. John Dybdahl came from Norway in the early 1850s, maybe even the late 1840s, but he had 2 wives, not at the same time, and that was quite common. If one wife died or one husband died, there'd be a marriage, a remarriage, I should say. This is an example of what I mentioned before about discovering some things through the QR. And again, the QR, it links to find a grave, and then and it depends on how much data is recorded on find a grave, you can learn a lot. Some graves have almost nothing other than maybe the name and the birth and death date. But I was out here with Jim Hurling, and we're doing a project out on the cemetery, and we discovered something confirmed by the QR after we looked at the code. And John Dybdahl, who came over from Norway, is the first of 7 generations at Vermont. There may be others, but this is the only one I know of where even the 7th generation are here and running around today. John Dybdahl, as they said in the Bible, John Dybdahl begat Albert Dybdahl. Albert Dybdahl begat Joe Dybdahl. Joe begat Paul, and Paul is here, I think, and he's been a president of the congregation. And Paul begat Stuart. Stuart is right over here, and another very active member. And Stuart begat Clayton and Addison. And there are the two little guys running around. So I thought it was pretty cool. I didn't miss anybody in those 7, did I? Every time I do it, I seem to leave somebody out, but I don't think I did. And Dave, of course, thank you. Yeah. And Dave is here too. So, but it was, again, kind of the discovery process with this QR. Those are facts that, if we all would have thought about, I think we would have known that. Yeah, there's 7 generations. But the QR tells a story that maybe we weren't aware of, or it brings attention to a story that we hadn't thought of. So John had, as I say, 2 wives, and it gets confusing if you do a QR on these, and simply it's just a matter of using your smartphone. Most of you know all this, but focusing on the QR code, and the one here is on the back side. Generally we wanted to keep them kind of obscure, so that when you walk out in the cemetery and say, "Oh, Vermont, you mean that's that place with all those QR codes all over the place?" Well, they are all over the place, but we tried to keep them a little bit subtle. Anyway, so all those names came up, and you notice that a bunch of the sons and daughters, or the sons, were named Johnson, and a bunch of them were named Albert. And the Johnsons were from one wife and Albert from the other. The Dibdalls, I should say. The Dibdalls were from the second wife, and the Johnsons from the first, or vice versa. I'm not even sure. But those are just some of the little stories. The other one that I wanted to draw attention to is this one right here. And that is Pastor John Fjeld. Pastor Fjeld was born in Norway and took his pastoral training in Norway, but he was called to Vermont as his first call. So he came from Norway to preach here at Vermont. Now that was when the old church was, well, you can see it just as you go around the corner. There's like a historical marker down there. That was the first building, formal building that the church used, starting about during the Civil War, so let's say 1863, 1864. And so he was the first pastor there. But in 1861, during the first year that he was here, he bought a farm. And it happens to be 120 acres surrounding us, including, the house wasn't there then, but on the east side of the hill. And ironically, that 120 acres is now almost all of it owned by Vermont Lutheran Church with the recent acquisition with the Legacy Fund. And so when he bought that in 1861, he almost immediately sold a 1/4 acre where the church stood for the purpose of building the church, and 2.5 acres right here that we're standing on for a cemetery. So that gave me a clue that, well, that's the first potential burials, although I haven't found any quite that old, but I think we can say pretty safely 1868 was probably the first burial here. And although that purchase wasn't recorded until 1872, which maybe that's when they started burying folks here, because there is a previous cemetery, and I'll still talk about that later, but it's just about a 1/4 mile that direction. And so my guess is that burials occurred on that early cemetery until about 1872, or maybe slightly earlier. So now, when I thought I had a really good story about Pastor John Fjeld, and Fjeld is the pronunciation back then, but now it's Field, and there are a number of fields buried here, and this, of course, was called the Field Farm or Fjeld Farm. But I had such a good story, but then I started fact-checking myself a little bit, and well, the story is accurate, except it wasn't Pastor Fjeld, it was Pastor S. Gunderson. So in about, I suppose it was 1911, when they started planning to build this church. The church over on the hillside was, well, it was pretty modest to say the least, but there was a building committee, and they started meeting, and they just couldn't get anywhere. They couldn't make a decision. But you can imagine, well, here's Pastor S. Gunderson, who wanted something glorious to worship God in, and yet then there's all these Norwegian farmers that were on the building committee that, you know, they're all born in Norway, and they probably didn't have $100 to their names, but we were supposed to build this beautiful church. Well, they were getting nowhere, and finally one of the committee members said, well, I make a motion to form a committee of one to get this church built, and I recommend that Pastor Gunderson be that committee by himself. And so if those of you have been in this church, you know how beautiful it is inside and all the intricate detail. Well, that all came from Pastor S. Gunderson and his notion of what a proper church should be. So the other note about Pastor Fjeld, who sold this property to the church, sold these about 3 acres to the church. He charged $10 for that purchase transaction. All right. Well, we're going to make our way back over to the blacktop and just up to the north just a little bit here. Okay. Well, I was going to point out this little spider hole here and ask if anybody knew what it was about. And what it is, it's a system probably 25 years ago. You notice there are watering spigots up and down the driveway here, and this is the low spot. And what's supposed to happen in the fall is those are open, the water is shut off at church, and there's supposed to be a valve down there. But apparently it got turned on up at church. But anyway, it's not very important, but I thought I'd point it out anyway. Something that I noticed one time not too long ago, if you look at all the cemetery markers, you know, they're obviously, most of them solid granite, but there's one right here that is metal, and it's like a galvanized metal. Jens Hauge died in 1899, and it's the only one I know of that is metal, and it's held up beautifully. It's over, well, it's 124 years old, but it's held up beautifully. That's something you don't see every day. The other thing from this position I'd like to point out is, well, we've got a lot of pine needles from these beautiful but pesky pine trees. Kathleen Warden, who is the sister of Virginia Johnson, many of you knew Virginia Johnson, and Janet Castle, who is here today too, that'd be their sister. She's the only World War II female veteran that is buried here, and to my knowledge, the only veteran female buried in the cemetery. I'm sure there'll be others as time goes on, but I just wanted to point out those things. Next, we're going to go over to the Mickelson Monument. It's not far. We'll go up the road just a little ways and then turn to our right. I see Julie Schmidt is here. Do you know any of these people, Julie? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot.
Well, they're your cousins. So
Except it's spelled differently than
it sure is.
Parents.
You know, one of the things I noticed as I documented all these grave sites is there are a lot of Mickelsons. In fact, Mickelson is the most popular name in the cemetery. Popular and between the two spellings of M-I-K-K and M-I-C-K, there are 82 burials of Mickelsons out here. I stopped here for a couple of reasons. There's some things I wanted to point out. One thing, all the Mickelsons. I think Barsness and Hauge are not too far behind that. But the other thing is, this is, to me, one of the saddest places on the cemetery. Now, I hate to talk about sad things, but we are in a cemetery, so there are some sad stories. Now, if you think about Ever and Betsy, that's Mom and Dad. And as you go down, here's Clarence, killed in World War I. I know your brother Paul told me about how that happened one time, and it wasn't nice. He looked out of his trench to see what was going on, and a German bullet hit him in the head. So that's Clarence. But look at all these kids. Ira, born in August of '98, died in July of 1912. Eva or Iva only lived a few days. Bertha, James, and I can't read that one from here. Baby, not even named, and Emma. Those are all siblings that died in such a short time. And as I talked before about how healthcare was not very good, and a lot of babies and a lot of young mothers died. But this, to me, this one is, can you imagine, Eva and Betsy watching all their children die. The other thing I'll point out, just a feature of the cemetery, is you'll notice some of these curbs, and they'll exist in a lot of old cemeteries, and they were to outline the family plot, if you will, and which we don't do anymore. And in fact, when the frost heaves them up, they get in the way of the lawnmower, and we're actually pulling them out as that happens because they're fairly bothersome. But the tradition was to have a plot of 6 graves and then surround them with a curb. But as I said, we're getting away from that quite a bit. So, all right. Any questions on those? Oh, just again, this was a QR thing that I just discovered in the last day or two. I was curious to know who Betsy was. Now, she married Iver Mickelson. And because if you look on a QR code, Betsy, her real name is actually Britta, Britta. That's our daughter's name. And I know it didn't come from her. It actually came from Britta Bordson. But I was curious to that, so I started to look, and I wondered where she came from. Well, what do you think her name was before she married Iver Mickelson? Well, it was Mickelson, but Mickelson. So, and they're not all related. Like in this case, I hope not. But there are at least 3 lines of Mickelsons out here in Vermont. Oh, I just one other note. There are 12 babies unmarked, I should say. They're unnamed, I should say. They're marked but unnamed, and at least another 20 or 25 that aren't even named, and maybe don't even have markers. So, but that was the way it was around the turn of the century. So, all right, we're going to move this way just a little ways. Well, I mentioned we're going to be stopping by a few veterans' graves, and this is one that I thought we just couldn't walk by without stopping, and it'd be Morris and Gilbert Scollett, which many of you knew both of them. And we'll talk about Gilbert first. He was kind of like the rest of the Scolletts, real boisterous and full of life and conversational. And he was an anti-aircraft gunnery sergeant in World War II. And I got a chance. He was about as deaf as he could be towards the end. But I had an opportunity on a Saturday afternoon and spent some time with him by ourselves. And he told about how he was near the end of the war. He was with his battery, and he heard something coming, as like a sound that he hadn't ever heard before. And pretty soon he realized that it was a jet airplane. This is 1945, and the Americans didn't have jet airplanes, but Gilbert was a pretty sharp guy. He knew that the Germans had jet airplanes, an Me-262 to be exact. And he said, by the time we got our gun unlimbered to take a shot at it, it was gone. And he said, following in pursuit was a P-47, American fighter, but it didn't stand a chance. So I really enjoyed the stories that Gilbert told, and he was also a supporter of anything that we did around here, whether it's the cemetery, the handicapped edition, whatever it was, Gilbert would always step up and help out. Now, Morris, on the other hand, was really, really quiet. And it'd be hard to get 2 words out of him sometimes. Is that fair to say,
Yeah.
Julie? And without a doubt, and Paul and I talked about, Julie's brother Paul and I talked about a number of times that they didn't have a word for it at that time, but he certainly had PTSD. And he fought in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, and that was just a meat grinder. And they accomplished nothing but killed over 20,000 Americans, and for no gain. But Morris was in the middle of that, and I've read some things about it. In fact, Paul and myself, my dad, and a couple others went over, and we found a cemetery. It's a German cemetery now, but it's where Morris and his company had to cross through this open area, and they were ambushed by a machine gun company of Germans, and about half his company were killed or wounded. So the things that we know that he saw and experienced, there's no wonder that he was the way he was. I think that's fair to say, and it's not a knock to Morris at all. But he was financial secretary at Vermont for a long time and involved in a lot of things. So, well, we'll move on. I've got another World War II story to tell. I hope you enjoy them. It's important to me, and it's important to the congregation. So, just over here a little ways. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Wilkins name. Tom Wilkins, probably the last person with that name in the congregation. But Barb Olson would be a brother to Tom. But the Wilkins were a pretty big family in this area. And Ted and Amalia, mom and dad, if you will, lived in Madison, but they came out to services here every Sunday, and they always came way ahead of services, and they'd sit out in their car and read the Sunday paper until it was time to go in. Well, they had a son, well, actually two sons named Joseph Wilkins. As you'll see here, there was one born in 1922 and March of 22 and died in March of 23, so another baby. And then they had another son after the first Joseph died, born in 1924, and they also named him Joseph. Well, he wanted to get into World War II in the worst way, and he begged and begged with his mom to sign off because he wasn't 18 yet. Finally, she had enough of the pestering, and she did sign off. And he ended up as a radio man and turret gunner on a B-24 bomber in England. And it just so happens that he was in the squadron that was commanded by Jimmy Stewart, the actor. And of course, Jimmy Stewart had already won an Academy Award, and so he was very, very well known. And he was a very good commander as well. But they were on a mission over Braunschweig, Germany. It's called something else now, Brunswick, I guess. But anyway, it was during a period they called Big Week, where there were 1,000 bomber raids going on all the time, and he was part of that. And Amalia got a telegram that said that Joey was missing, and she had no idea what had happened. So she actually wrote to Jimmy Stewart and thought maybe he would know more. And he wrote back to her and said, "No, I don't know any more than what you've been notified of." And well, I have found that not to be exactly true, because there's a biographical book about a number of them about Jimmy Stewart's time in the squadron, and there's a very detailed explanation of the bombing run that Joey was part of. And they were flying. They had dropped their bombs over Braunschweig and had turned to go home, and then they were attacked by fighters again. And just above and to the right of Jimmy Stewart's plane, a plane exploded, just completely exploded. And Jimmy asked his co-pilot, "Who was that?" And his co-pilot said, "That was the plane called Bullet Serenade, of all names, Bullet Serenade." And that was the plane that Joey was on. So he did know what happened to him. And the squadron is a small group, so he certainly knew Joey. And this marker was, there was no marker for Joseph, the one who was killed, he's actually buried in Margarten, Netherlands, and I've visited the grave a time or two. And in fact, there's a guy that on Memorial Day, the U.S. Memorial Day, puts a flower on Joey's grave every year. But the Cemetery Association decided we need to have something for Joey. So I don't know, Greg was probably on the committee at that time, but maybe 25 years ago, the committee got together and put a proper marker here, even though Joey is not buried here. So, well, let's work our way this way. As we go up here, one of the popular grave markers these days seems to be benches. And one I'd point out here, this is actually Paul Schollett's marker. It would be their family marker. And Joni called me one day and asked about, well, can we put a bench in instead of a marker? And she explained it to me that it was going to be a black granite with this Gaelic print on it and that kind of thing. And I said, well, certainly, do whatever you want. We don't have very many regulations. We have a few, but not many. And so it was put up, and I just think it's one of the nicest markers on the cemetery. And you'll see others too. There's a field, if you will, or field up in the corner there. There's a couple others here too, but that's kind of a trend that we're seeing, and they're perfectly fine. Trick is to have enough space for them, but we can usually work that out. So we'll just move up onto the blacktop a little ways. So the gravestone I want to point out here is the marker of, well, I called him Lorne Knowles, but it's Lawrence Knowles. And he would be Eric Haugen's uncle. And I'm always looking for these World War II type stories. And at Philip Schollett's funeral, I got a chance to talk to Lorne. And he was a B-29 pilot. And he flew some 32, 33 missions over Tokyo from Guam. And he told me the importance of taking Iwo Jima. I always wondered what was so important about Iwo Jima. It's just this little island. And it's about halfway between Tokyo and Guam. And so prior to taking Iwo Jima, these pilots had no place to ditch, no place to land, refuel, or anything until they got back to Guam. But after Iwo was taken, that was available to them. There was already an airfield there. And Lorne said he I don't remember, it was 7 or 8, but 7 or 8 times he actually aborted to Iwo on his way home from a bombing mission over Tokyo. So that you always learn something. Well, and we can stay right here for this next part. This is the end of, we'll call it the old cemetery now, even though the old cemetery used to end where those yew trees were. And then in about 1954, this section was added, and I'm sure people thought, well, this will last us forever. Well, it didn't. And in fact, 3 or 4 years ago, I predicted that the cemetery as it was would be full by 2035 at the rate we were having funerals and burials. But a couple things have happened since then. One, the rate of cremations. There's 80% of the burials are cremations now, so that obviously buys us some time. But the other thing that happened, there was a proposal or a goal, let's say, by the Cemetery Association to add some acreage to the cemetery for future expansion. And what we really wanted is about 2.5 acres to the north here. And there was a survey done, and we thought we had a good chance in buying that 2.5 acres from the neighbors. And so that was our hope. But then that wasn't going anywhere. And we thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity to buy more. For one thing, to preserve the view to the east, because of this 115 acres that's adjacent to us, if there were houses built, the obvious place to build them would be there and there, right along the road into the rising sun. So we're hoping that wouldn't happen. So I think this was probably a brainchild of Greg Hurling. Let's start a legacy fund so that there's a vehicle for people who want to donate to a specific cause, and that cause was to be able to have money to buy adjacent property. Well, to make a long story short, we ended up buying the whole farm, 115 acres. So now, and you've heard probably most of you have heard that whole story, but it's ironic now that the Vermont Church owns the farm that Pastor Fjeld bought back in 1860, and except for the small portion where the house stands. So once this legacy fund was in place, people started stepping forward, and I guess I'm proud to say that the Cemetery Association put in the first $125,000 into that fund. Well, then others followed, and we had, it's just incredible how people step forward. And so now we have this property, and we've established this is already plotted out by GPS surveying. There's 235 grave sites on the right, and there's one grave here, and that's John Halleck, who was one of the prime benefactors of helping us get this land bought. And so it was appropriate, even though this was his passion, to get some land bought for Vermont. He knew he had cancer, and it took him. But so he's the only one buried here at this point, up at the top of the hill. The other thing we are going to be establishing fairly soon, well, actually sooner than I thought, because if you see where those two white markers are on that little mound, there's going to be a marker there, and that area, we're going to call it a scattering forest, and we're going to keep it kind of rustic looking, keep the brush and the branches cleaned up, but it will be a place for scattering cremains. And that marker, well, I just marked it this morning because Peckman Memorials will be here next week to start the project, or start the process, I should say. And so the marker is simply going to be, it's going to have an inscription on it. All are from dust, and to dust we all return. That's from Ecclesiastics. And already the first scattering has occurred last Saturday. There was interest in it. We weren't, I suppose you could say we weren't ready for it, but why not? And so there were 2 cremains scattered in the forest already. And hopefully we'll have the marker here shortly, and it will be a place for somebody who wants to take that route. It'll on the marker, it'll just be the name and the birth and death dates, and there will be no marking out in the cemetery or out in the scattering forest. You'll never know where it was. A family will, but so they can have their private service or whatever they want to do. But it's kind of a, well, I think it's going to catch on. I think it really is. I think there'll be interest, but time will tell. And so that's what's happening on the west side there. So I think that's about all I need to add to that. Yeah, let's just continue up the blacktop for a little ways. I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention it, but there are at least 3 pastors, former pastors, buried here. One is Pastor Peter T.N. Borgen, as he was known. He was here from, I'm going to say, 1962 to about 1980. I could be off on that, but he was here for quite a long time. And a good Norwegian from, at one time he came from South Dakota, and his wife is buried there with him. And the story I have to tell, it's not a big story, but it's about Mary, actually. Ted died first, and there used to be a bench here that was pretty worn out. There was re-rods sticking out of it, and it was in really bad shape. And Mary called me one time, and she said, "You know that bench? I really like to sit on that and just contemplate." She said, "But someday it's probably going to get me because it's going to poke a hole in me." So she said, I will be glad to fund a new marker. And she said, "Don't tell anybody that I did this." Well, she's passed now too, so I'm telling. She funded the bench, and so that's the kind of people that we seem to attract, is generous people that have good ideas. So we'll move forward. So we'll just make this a brief stop, but as I told you, it seems like every time I come out here, I learn something, whether it's with the QR, the aid of the QR or not. But one time I noticed this inscription under Charles Bergman's name, pioneer in the invention of the MRI machine. I think that's pretty incredible. Well, does anybody know who his wife was? Excuse me?
Ingrid.
No,
No?
she was a Tollefson.
Flora Bell Tollefson.
Bell.
Cal Tollefson's oldest sister. I'm pretty sure she was the oldest.
Yeah.
And I think of Calvin, we have a scholarship program in his name, and it makes me think, well, maybe Cal probably didn't even, well, I imagine he graduated high school, but not much more. But he did recognize the value of education, and maybe this was part of his experience and what influenced him. But again, just a brief stop, and I looked him up a little bit, and I don't know what role he played, and I didn't spend a lot of time. But it was invented, I was thinking, in New York at Cornell University. So I would guess that's where Charles worked, but I don't know that for a fact. Okay, let's work our way down the hill. Well, and this is the site of our, I'll say, most recent burial other than the scattering. And it's the grave of Max Rosenbaum. Lived to be 99, was doing real well to the end, and also a World War II veteran, very badly wounded, but he is also the donor that funded our memorial garden that went in last summer, and that was in honor of his wife Betty, who was working in her own garden 2.5 years ago and fell, and it sounded like she was going to do okay, but she took a turn for the worse and died. And there's Max at 97 at that time. He still was living in his own condo, pretty much by himself at that point, and he wanted to do something to honor Betty, so he funded the memorial garden that we'll see at the end of the tour. The next spot we can cover right from here. If you see the red granite Ravnon gravestone, that's Marcus and Joran Ravnon. They never were members of Vermont, but they were both born in Norway. Marcus was a World War II veteran from the U.S., and I don't know the chronology of when he moved over, but he went back to Norway and married Joran and came back, and they lived in Black Earth for quite some time. And when Joran died, Marcus wanted her buried out by those Norwegians in Vermont. And so he bought a lot, I think six plots, and he put this beautiful marker up, and he was so particular, he wouldn't let us mow his plot, the sixth grave. And I don't know who was involved at that time, but that was allowed, obviously. But every week he would come with his push mower and mow it and fertilize it. I think he sodded it to start with, and he just kept it meticulously. And they're both passed now, and I think their daughter Marit is buried there now too. But that was, one of the fancier, bigger plots that we had for a long, long time. So we'll just go straight down the hill here. How many of you have heard of Smoky's Supper Club in Madison? Most of you probably had. Well, Leonard Schmock and Janet Schmock, that was their restaurant. And Janet comes from town of Vermont until she died here a couple of years ago. But she was coming out to our lutefisk dinner, meatball dinner, almost every activity, because she loved it out here. And this was her home, obviously. But and she lived where, just as you go up Blue Mountains Trail on the left, is called the Punzuk place, for those of you. Well, there aren't many of you, but anyway. Yeah, you'd know. Yeah, right across from your farm. Yep. And she went to the Sandridge School, or no, not the Sandridge, a Steensherd school, of course, up on the hill. And now, I don't know. It's something I think that my mom teased my dad about most, but my mom says that Janet was his first girlfriend because he would walk from our farm at the bottom of this hill up to the Steensherd school and meet Janet on the way, and then they'd walk up to the school. I don't know. But I do know that every time that Janet came to one of these gatherings and my dad was there, she'd come over and give him a big kiss. So I don't know. Anyway, she was a very good supporter of everything we did out here. It didn't surprise me at all to get a call from her or get a check in the mail for something for the cemetery or whatever. Okay.
John,
Excuse me.
her dad, when he passed, that was the first person that I can remember my folks going to a funeral, and I was, 10 years old at that
When her dad passed. Yep.
Dad,
Yep.
a neighbor to us on the farm.
Yeah. Well, I don't remember him, but you're a lot older than me.
So quick anecdote about Early.
Yep. Yeah, that was her name. Most people knew her by
I
that.
had a friend in Florida, a guy that flew his private jet up here for Lutefisk Saturday. Came in on Saturday morning, came to Lutefisk dinner. She introduced me to him, and he flew home. And I said, well, I've heard of going a long ways for Lutefisk, but that kind of,
Yeah. And it also tells you a little bit about the kind of company she kept.
yes.
Yep. I don't know if my dad would have fit in that, though. Okay, well, we're just going to go down here a very short distance. And I'd like to draw your attention to this marker on my right, John and Siri Barsness. It's, again, one of the bigger and fancier markers here. It just happens that John is my great-great-grandfather, and Wayne Barsness's great-great-grandfather, and also great-great-grandfather to a lot of Barsnesses, because he had a family of, you'd probably know better, I'm saying 8 boys?
Wasn't that many, 6.
6 boys.
And 4 girls.
And 4 girls. So there's a lot of Barsness names still around. And one of the significance to me anyway is that John was drafted into the Civil War in late 1864, and it makes me think about a lot of these Norwegian veterans in the Civil War who had just come from Norway to escape whatever it was they were trying to escape, and come to this land of such great promise, and a few years later they're in the Civil War, and it's just hard to imagine. But John and one of his best buddies, I'd like to think, I don't know this for sure, but I assume they were good friends. One of his good friends was Johannes Ernest, who was my great-great-grandfather. And if you go to Norway, Ernest, a little town of Ernest, is on one side of the fjord, Barsness is on the other side. And they ended up here. The Ernest farm is down here. The Barsness farm is a mile away to the north. And they both fought in the Civil War. They got into Atlanta just after it was taken in late 1864 and joined Sherman's March to the Sea, which it was just devastated Georgia and split the Confederacy in two and probably speeded up the end of the war. It wasn't a real dangerous mission for them because they weren't really after trying to eliminate the Confederate soldiers. They wanted to eliminate resources, and they sure did. So that's the connection that I have between the Barsnesses. And there's so many Barsnesses around. Again, we have Wayne here, but I think of Shirley Asherman. She was a Barsness. And I think of, I had to write a couple down. Donna Schultz, who died not long ago. She was a Barsness. The
Playing behind the tree.
Well, I'm glad you noticed it because it wasn't easy to arrange that. That's great. We'll go to great lengths. But the Westfalls, Mrs. Westfall, Beverly was a Barsness. And then, of course, all the Barsnesses that still have that last name, too, around. So I would say after Mickelson, it'd either be Barsness or Hauge as far as the number of burials here. So with that, we'll go this direction just a little ways. Just a few more stops to go. Well, the grave site that I wanted to note here was that of Marvel Haugen. So how many of you knew Marvel? Probably not too many. Yeah, a few. Well, you know, the Lutheran Church, I don't think they have saints. There's some people that should be, and one of those would be Marvel. If you took a nomination for a saint, she is Eric Haugen's mother, and died of cancer, brain tumor. In I think how old would she be? They're 46, 40. I don't know. I can't count that quick. 49, right? And it was just probably one of the saddest days at Vermont. But she was a Sunday school teacher, Bible school teacher. She took care of the junior choir, taught us all kinds of songs. Quite a gal. Just wanted to take note of that. Oh, and then I was talking with Eric last Saturday, actually, when we were cleaning up some of the monuments, and he said that he even had her as a teacher in grade school as a substitute. And we got talking about some other things that Marvel had been teaching, but in the mid-60s, there was a new state law that said you had to have special training if you want to continue to be a teacher. So a number of ladies from here, and it was ladies at that time pretty much, Marvel and Grace Scollett, and I'm not so sure if T. Scollett didn't go as well. They went to University of Wisconsin-Platteville. Of course, it was Platteville College at that time, and they went to summer school and got their certificates so they could continue teaching. And but Marvel was down in Platteville that summer, and quite a gal. All right, a couple more here. Well, you notice the flags, so you can probably expect a veteran story. Well, this one is pretty interesting to me, and important. Robert Anderson was Irene Dauk's brother. It'd be Mary Nelson's uncle, and he was in the Army during the Korean War. And when the U.S. and its allies were trying to push the North Koreans back, the Chinese joined the fight and came across the border by the hundreds of thousands. And Robert Anderson's unit was surrounded. They were trying to retreat. And when they got back to safety, Robert wasn't with them. And that's all anybody knows, really. It happened near the Chosin Reservoir, if you've heard of that battle. But I know Mary has gone to various seminars and that type of thing, and met with missing in action people, and in hopes that maybe when the North Koreans return some bodies, that her uncle would be identified. So far, no deal, but there's still some hope. So that's Robert Anderson. And this marker is kind of another one of those where the Cemetery Association thought, well, we should have this noted somewhere here. Even though he's not buried here, nobody knows where he is. But they put this in, and Spellman Monument Company, who sells quite a few of the monuments here, they made this and donated it, no charge. So I thought that was quite a nice gesture by that group.
John?
Yeah.
Last spring, we went to one of those meetings.
Yep.
In Chicago, and when our president was over there, he got like 55 caskets brought back. Well, I was under the impression there was one person to caskets. No, there's all kinds of remains in there. And those caskets are in Annapolis, Maryland. And they got those people that do the...
So they're still sorting through all of that. So there's still hope.
Imagine 55 caskets.
Yeah.
Remains that were just dumped together.
Yep. Well, I guess one last point on veterans. Right over here we have two brothers, Russell and Richard Redeman, who were veterans of the Vietnam War. Both survived the war, but both didn't live long afterward. They died as rather young men. So, all right, we'll just keep going to the south here. We'll make this our last stop, but I'm going to cover three things from this area. One is well, we called it the Betty Underwood Rosenbaum Memorial Garden that was established last summer with funding from Max at that time. And there are 42 varieties of perennials, and it turned out way better than any of us could imagine. It was a pretty neat project, a lot of help involved. And one of the new additions this year is that now we have a QR code for it, which is right at the entrance, I believe is where it's placed. And there's a map of all the different flowers, and then a key that says what each one was. I've spent enough hours in there wondering what some of those were that I thought we should have a map. So that's another feature of the QR. And Tracy was a big help in that effort, and it turned out pretty nice. We may add some improvements as time goes on, but it's one way to identify some of those flowers, which some of you probably know most of them already. Does anybody like to tell me how to pronounce this name on this marker here? Don't be bashful.
Furuheim.
I knew an old Norwegian, a young Norwegian would know that one. Furuheim. Yeah, and it just, again, I was out here doing some project and looking up who they were, and I assumed with a name like Furuheim that maybe Eric, the father, was German. Well, I found out from a friend of Judy's that no, he was born in Norway, in fact, so it's purely Norwegian. But again, Furuheim, I know very little Norwegian, but some German, and to me that would be the master's home. Well, during World War II, the Führer was you-know-who.
Yeah.
But I can just imagine that the master's home would be, God's home. And then I looked closer. If you look at the windows on either side that are depicted, and you look at the windows inside the church, they're a very, very close match. And so I just thought it was an interesting marker and wanted to stump somebody on how to say Führerheim.
Julie was here.
Yeah, and good thing Julie was here. And Doris was financial secretary here at Vermont for quite a long time, or treasurer. I'm not sure which office she held, but she was quite a gal. She worked at Hilldale State Bank, and just a go-getter. The last thing I have is, if you see the P. Anderson Monument over here, a great big piece of granite. Well, I don't know those people, and I haven't looked them up, but I did mention earlier that there was an earlier cemetery here at Vermont, and that was over, well, it's about a quarter of a mile that direction, actually on the farm that I have. And there were burials there that go back to the 1850s, some of the early, that's why we call it the Pioneer Cemetery. It was in the early 1900s, it was pretty much obliterated. It was in a pasture, weeds grew up. We knew it was there, but didn't know much about it. In fact, one of the family stories was that some of the kids, who were my great aunts, would go over, and Martha Mickelson as well, would pick them up, the markers, they were wooden markers, and bring them home and show mom and dad. Well, they got, as my grandma Ernest would say, they got the dickens. And so they had to take them back. Well, then there were fires and that kind of thing, so they were destroyed. But in the 1940s, Elvie Stensrud, who would be T's uncle, T. Perel's uncle, he got in his mind that should be noted somehow. And as it was, that marker that's over there now, which is kind of a crude looking thing, but kind of neat to look at, was right here on this Anderson site. And they had replaced it with this red granite, and they just took the old one and threw it in the ditch down here. But Elvie got a team of horses and a stone boat and dragged it over to the old cemetery, and then had it re-inscribed with the names. And there's 13 names on there, and then it just says, and some children. So we don't know how many children are there, but there are names that, like Flosshaugen, for example, which nobody's heard of Flosshaugen, but that was Tullifson back in the day. So you have to be a little bit of a detective to figure out who they were, but a lot of the early pioneers, and all of them born in Norway, obviously, except for the children. So with that, if there are any questions, otherwise that's the tour.
Just a quick question, how many burial sites are over there at that old
13 named,
13?
and then those children.
And can you go walk over there?
Yes.
Anyone?
Yeah. There's a couple days a month that I close it up because we have a shooting range over there, and there's no way that anybody would ever get it. You know, the bullets would go that far. But I still don't want anybody there when that's going on. So you can just go to the bottom of the hill and turn right, and you follow the path, and it's there.
Well, John,
Yeah.
you said that marker was originally here.
Yep.
Well, then the burial site.
Oh, we don't know where they are. We know about where they are. There were 3 huge oak trees. There's one left that marked the spot. I mean, they were just giant oak trees, and like I say, there's one left, and it's a giant too. So if you can imagine between those 3, that's where they were. But where they were specifically, nobody knows.
That was very good.
All right. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Very good.